All right. Thanks for joining us for the next session in the Media and Family Track of the Within Summit. As a reminder, you can access all your conference information and sessions from the attendee dashboard, and all of the sessions this week are recorded and made available to attendees in that dashboard. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker for this session, William Hornby. William is a speaker, advocate, and singer at the forefront of raising awareness for men with eating disorders. He speaks publicly on advocacy, mental health, and eating disorder recovery. He travels around the world, both in person and virtually, giving workshops and presentations on the power of becoming the advocate you needed, which is the session he'll be presenting here today. He is also the recipient of the William Donald Schaefer Helping People Award for 2021 and has collaborated with the National Alliance for Eating Disorders and the National Eating Disorder Association. There will be hopefully some time for Q&As at the end, so feel free to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, William. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. And without further ado, let's get started. So this is the power of becoming the advocate you needed. This is something that I am extremely familiar with. And I am so excited to share it with you today. So a little about me. I grew up in Maryland, in specifically Carroll County, and then I moved to Baltimore for Baltimore School for the Arts, which is a prestigious arts high school that my parents gracefully supported me in going to. And I was a classical voice major there. I studied with an incredible opera singer. And from there, I went to pre-college at Carnegie Mellon, and then I went to Temple University and I got a BFA in musical theater and a BBA in business management, which took me 5 years. So a little about my eating disorder. I developed it around the time I was 11 years old, and I went undiagnosed until the age of 20, which some of you might astutely point out is a long time to go undiagnosed. And the very obvious cause of that lack of diagnosis was that even though I was presenting very obvious symptoms, I was a guy and nobody was really looking for an eating disorder in me because I was a guy. And that was really hard. More on that later. So I developed my eating disorder largely because of familial influence, as well as growing up doing musical theater, both growing up in a diet culture household, as well as being an actor and being around all of the body expectations that are placed on performers did wonders for developing my eating disorder. As well as I am a gay man, and later on in my life, when I was an adult, I was partaking in hookup culture. And depending on where you are in the gay community, and I was not in the best place in the gay community, I was consistently encountering people who were placing very toxic body expectations on my body and also theirs, which is never a great environment to be in. So I had a more restrictive eating disorder around the time I was in middle and high school. And as I got to college, I started to eat more consistently. And it transformed into more of a binge and restrict cycle, feeling a lot of food guilt around those binges that led to restriction and the cycle that comes with that. But despite all of that, the only eating disorders I really knew of were bulimia nervosa and anorexia nervosa, which is something that a lot of people experience. Those are like the two that people get educated on in middle school health classes. So I was like, well, I'm not anorexic and I'm not bulimic, so I must not have a bad enough eating disorder to like ask for any help with it. And then furthermore, I went vegetarian, which I claimed was for the environment, but really it was not for the environment. It was a further form of restriction. So I started to meet with a registered dietitian at my university, and she was absolutely incredible. She took me into the intake appointment, and I started to describe my relationship with food to her. And I was like, yeah. And so essentially, I think I'm eating vegetarian wrong. And she was like, I think you're doing a lot of things wrong. I'm going to send you to a therapist, and then we can continue to work together. And I was like, oh, seems like maybe there might be something legitimate going on here. I started seeing the therapist that she recommended, and that therapist diagnosed me with an eating disorder, that eating disorder being OSFED, which stands for Other Specified Feeding or Eating Disorders. Um, but it was my first time in therapy, and I needed therapy for a lot of other things as well. So I really focused on those things in therapy, and not my eating disorder, and ended up ghosting my registered dietitian until I was about to study abroad in Rome in spring of 2020. Um, I actually had an easier time with food in Rome because the food culture is so wonderful. But it was spring of 2020, so obviously coronavirus hit Italy, and I was exiled from the country because that is what we all did when that happened. So I left Rome, started to quarantine in the United States, and immediately fell very hard back into my eating disorder. Um, but this time I reached out for help. I knew I needed help. I expressed to my therapist, like, now is the time to work on this. I started talking with my dietitian again, and I really committed to recovery. Um, and then a little detour is I started carving pumpkins on TikTok. It was October 2020, and the internet made me very anxious, but I started carving pumpkins on TikTok, and I am a self-taught pumpkin carver, and the first pumpkin I posted on TikTok went viral. So I started carving pumpkins. I carved 18 pumpkins in the October of 2020, and I I got to the end of October and my hand felt arthritic, and I was like, I never want to post a video again. But I started to think, like, I have like 13,000 followers on TikTok, which seemed like a huge amount at the time. And I was like, what am I going to do with this platform that I have? And so I was like, I know that I really needed a man to be talking about eating disorder recovery when I was in the beginning of recovery. Because, long story short, not having a man talking about it made me feel incredibly alone. And I'll talk about that more later as well. Um, but I got to Thanksgiving 2020, and I really sat down with myself and I was like, I think I want to start to make recovery content geared towards men on TikTok. And I had a conversation with my boyfriend about it. He was like, if you feel like you're ready for that, you should absolutely do it. And so I started to do it. I changed my account from at William Carves Pumpkins to at William Carved Pumpkins. And then I had my first viral video about eating disorder recovery. And very quickly, I had a growing platform that was growing by thousands a day. And it was kind of intimidating because I hadn't done so much research on this, but suddenly people were really expecting me to know what I was talking about. And so I took it upon myself to constantly talk to my registered dietitian and my therapist about like responsible things I could be talking about, making sure that like I really set up a responsible platform. And as time went on, I became friends with a lot of registered dietitians and mental health professionals, and they collaborate with me. I am in community with them, and I feel very confident that if I were ever to post anything problematic, that they would call me on it. Um, so there were a lot of things I needed from advocates that I wasn't getting as a viewer of advocacy content. The main things that I've boiled down for this presentation are I needed a man to be talking about eating disorders, so I needed male representation. I needed someone to be talking about self-gaslighting in mental health. I needed someone to talk about how diagnoses aren't the end-all be-all of mental health. I needed someone to be talking about the eating disorder that I had, which was in fact not anorexia or bulimia. It was other specified feeding or eating disorders, which a lot of people don't talk about and a lot of people are unaware of. I needed someone to be talking with a fat studies informed lens. I needed to uh, hear more recovery content that was informed by research into fat studies, so fat scholarship. And I also needed someone to be talking about eating disorders within the gay community. Um, and so, male representation, right? Um, there were very few resources for men that I could find at the beginning of my recovery, my committed recovery. And I thought I was going, I had no idea why I wasn't finding these things. And I was like, I'll ask my dietitian and I'll ask my therapist, can you help me find like content for men with eating disorders? And they came up with no resources as well. And there really weren't any influencers who were talking about it in a helpful way. Influencers that were men, that is. And a lot of the ones who were talked about it in a problematic slash like thinly veiled fat phobic way. And there were also very few websites that I could find that talked about men's eating disorder recovery in a thorough way. And ultimately, it harmed my recovery. It's something that I think would have set me back in my recovery if I hadn't had such a strong support system. And I acknowledge that that is a huge privilege because a lot of people don't have the healthcare to have a registered dietitian and a therapist. So I knew that I was not the only person going through this. Um, I started to look up stats and find stats where I could. And it turns out that less than 1% of all eating disorder research is conducted on men. And that is a pretty hard statistic to deal with when you level with the fact that 25 to 40% of all people with eating disorders are men. That is such a disproportionate percentage. Um, and also, it's really important for cis and trans men and non-binary people to see men talking about eating disorder recovery because we live in a patriarchy and we demonize anything that is feminine and as a society. And eating disorders have largely been labeled as a feminine thing that affect almost exclusively women. And that is shown by less than 1% of all eating disorder research being conducted on men. And so, for a lot of trans people and non binary people in particular who are AFAB, they they feel like their eating disorder invalidates their gender identity and makes them less of a man or less of a more masculine person. As well as a lot of cis men are afraid to admit that they have eating disorders or any troubles eating because they're afraid of having their masculinity questioned. So an important part of all of this is deconstructing toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is not just a buzzword, and toxic masculinity kills. It increases chances of homicide, femicide, and suicide. It prevents men from asking for help, and it also prevents men from learning empathy, as well as eating disorders are an incredibly deadly mental illness, and a lot of people with eating disorders die by suicide. A lot of men die by suicide, and men successfully die by suicide at a much higher rate than women. And so, how does that relate to eating disorders? Uh, Eating disorders are feminized, and men are less likely to reach out for help because reaching out for help is also feminized. And men are less likely to admit that they have a problem. Eating disorders are presented to men as a part of masculinity, and that's another issue. We've worked in this expectation that bodies be incredibly muscular and that you eat in a manly way into the way that we define masculinity as a culture. And so a lot of men feel attacked when their eating is called into question by anyone because it's like it's an attack on their masculinity. It's an attack on their identity, and it isn't, in fact, but it feels like it to them. So the solution is we need more representation and furthermore education. More men need to be in recovery, and more men need to know that they have eating disorders. And also, when more men know that they have an eating disorder, when more men go into recovery, more men in recovery will speak out about being in recovery. And the more men we have speaking out about recovery, hopefully, the more men we have taking it upon themselves to educate themselves about how to responsibly be an advocate in this space, which is also tied into masculinity because a lot of the time men don't love to admit that they don't know everything. And so it takes a certain amount of willingness to learn, especially from people who don't have your shared identities, to be able to do this work in an educated way. So moving on, self-gaslighting is a really, really important concept in mental health that I did not see spoken about a lot when I was really struggling with it. Gaslighting is the act of convincing a party that an event that happened did not actually happen. It actually comes from an old Hollywood film called Gaslight, where a man is essentially turning off things like the gas lights in the house and making the woman in the movie go crazy because he's like, I'm not doing that. And she's like, I know you're doing that. And he's like, no, I'm not, even though he is. And so that's where the term gaslighting comes from, in case you've ever been curious. But the whole thing that I like to say about self-gaslighting is if you have to ask whether something is going on, something probably is. Is it the thing that you think is going on? Perhaps not. But if you have any inkling that you like might need help mentally, it's worth asking for help and getting some kind of evaluation if you have access to that. I wish someone had talked to me about this because I was gaslighting myself into believing I wasn't sick enough for years. And our mental illnesses want to stick around. This is a thing that they do to get us to not get better. It's going on up there in your brain. Your mental illness is convincing you not to address it. um, you're constantly going to be saying things like, it's not bad enough, it's not actually happening, which prevented me for years from seeking help for my eating disorder. And comparison is the thief of joy and recovery. You can't compare your mental health to other people's mental health, which leads into diagnosis isn't everything. Diagnoses are not the end all be all of mental health. Now, diagnoses can be super helpful and validating, but also diagnoses are inaccessible because healthcare is inaccessible. In the US, healthcare, especially mental health care, is not accessible due to financial barriers, either having a lack of healthcare or not being able to afford healthcare that you do have. Whereas in the UK and in other places with more socialized medicine, there's not enough supply for the demand. So even though it is more affordable to have healthcare, the wait lists are incredibly long and hard to bypass. Um, there's also the issue that diagnoses are not perfect, and a lot of times they are for insurance purposes. If you look up diagnostic criteria online to compare yourself to it and see, like, do I have this thing? Should I go get screened by a professional for this thing? And you look up a list, and a lot of that list doesn't feel like it applies to you. You could still have something like that thing or adjacent to that thing. And the fact that you're looking up a list about whether you're mentally ill is already a good indicator that something is going on. But if you look up that list of diagnostic criteria and you don't match it, you might tell yourself, oh, there's nothing wrong, actually. I don't have that, so nothing's wrong. And that is not a great way to go about things. But also, another plus to diagnoses is that they often are a really nice gateway to treatment. Um, and so that is some really important context around diagnoses that I really wish I had known, and it's something I try to talk about a lot. Another thing is other eating disorders. As I mentioned, there are many other eating disorders other than anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. I have OSFED, which again is other specified feeding or eating disorders, which is kind of an umbrella term for all eating disorders that don't fall into a specific diagnostic. Uh, it's a catch-all almost, which can make it feel invalidating. When I was diagnosed with OSFED, I was like, oh, so it's not a real eating disorder. And it is, in fact, a real eating disorder. Um, any problems that you are having with eating are worth addressing, especially if there's any kind of emotional component to it. If there's not an emotional component, maybe it's more of a disordered eating situation, but it is more likely to be classified as an eating disorder if you are eating in a disordered way and you feel some type of way about it. If you feel emotional about food in a negative way, or even sometimes in a positive way, it's worth talking with an eating disorder professional just to maybe get screened. I highly recommend seeing registered dietitians if you have access to, um, or following them online if you don't have access to them. Um, Also, mental health problems uh, are what eating disorders are. You can have an eating disorder without having the physical problems that most people would associate with an eating disorder. They are mental health problems with physical consequences. There are much more physical aspects to a diagnosis or a situation like anorexia nervosa than there is for other specified feeding or eating disorders. But that doesn't mean that both aren't equally worth addressing, and it does not invalidate your OSFED that the person because the person next to you has anorexia. Both are worth treating. Another really important thing is fat scholarship and being informed on it. You cannot really be a fat scholar if you're not fat. So I just want to put a caveat in here that I am not a fat person. I cannot consider myself a fat scholar, but I do try to learn from fat people as much as I can. And it is really important that you pay attention to fat scholarly text if you are if you're doing this kind of work. Fat scholarship is a really young discipline. It's only about 20 years old, but it's a really important discipline. Um, Not all eating disorders are rooted in fat phobia, but all eating disorders exist within a fat phobic society, and everyone, and that means everyone in society, has a responsibility to unlearn fat phobia. And as a plus, if you have an eating disorder that is informed by fat phobia, and even if you think yours isn't, it still might be because we've all grown up in this fat phobic society together. Um, it's it will help your recovery to learn about anti-fatness and learning about how to uh, destigmatize being fat. Um, Advocating for recovery without actively educating yourself on anti-fatness is irresponsible. And helping the most oppressed person in society lifts everyone up. We shouldn't be advocating for mid-sized people, quote unquote, to be liberated. We should be advocating for the fattest people in society to be liberated because that liberates everyone. Fat people are most affected by diet culture and systemic and social anti-fatness, and therefore we need to be advocating for the fattest people in society to be liberated. And then also gay eating disorders, LGBTQ plus eating disorders. Eating disorders in gay men in particular is something I can talk about personally. Hookup culture really, really perpetuates eating disorders in gay men. Gay men in popular media also are often ripped, often very, very skinny, and often the way that they are portrayed, because a lot of the popular culture around the gay community, mixed with the like Hollywood ideals, ends up presenting an incredibly fat phobic, an incredibly white, and an incredibly rich experience of being gay. Um, and Also, the gay community, specifically the white, cis, built gay community, is known very, very well for racism and exclusivity. And this term gay fat, which is really just a horrible term, and one that should absolutely not be used. But gay fat is in reference to anyone who is not like a very skinny or very chiseled gay man. And that is a term that is very familiar within this community, and that's really heartbreaking and something that we need to get rid of. And dieting and exercise are like a required barrier to entry almost for a lot of the community. But it doesn't have to be this way. The gay community is more than the white and muscular. And you, as a queer person, if you are a queer person, can find queer community that accepts you for who you are. There are so many people who are not white and not muscular and not cis within the queer community that are going to be very happy to have you in community with them. Stop pressuring yourself to be in community with the more toxic parts of the LGBTQ community. Um, Also, eating disorders are feminized, as we said before. The stigma is harmful to trans men and trans masculine people, and it furthers gender dysphoria. How can I be a man, or how can I be a masculine presenting person if I have an exclusively women's health problem? Um, Also, it should be noted that eating disorders can also be a response to trauma. Living as an LGBTQ person is a traumatic experience. And living as any minority is a traumatic experience. And so eating disorders are also traumatic in themselves, which kind of just creates this trauma explosion within a lot of gay people with eating disorders. Um, and they can be a way of controlling things that are going on in a way of creating the illusion of control of something in your life when you feel out of control of a lot of the things. Discrimination can be something that you feel very much like you don't have control over, and often you do not. And a lot of people turn to harmful things like eating disorders to feel like they have control over some aspect of their lives. Um, and so I kind of developed some pillars of advocacy for my own advocacy. And so we're going to talk about how you can become a responsible advocate, specifically in the eating disorder space. But if you have anything else that you don't see in society, you could easily create your own pillars for advocacy, and we will get to that later. But let's talk about fat studies again. You must partake in fat studies to advocate for eating disorder recovery. If you are not reading the work of fat scholars and listening to and including fat people, you are not doing inclusive recovery work. And eating disorders disproportionately affect fat people. Try to find a fat person who has never been told to diet. Dieting is the number one predictor of developing an eating disorder. If people are constantly commenting on your body, telling you to exercise more, telling you to diet more, telling you to try this diet or this diet, you are very likely to develop an eating disorder. A lot of fat people have dealt with eating disorders and are often considered like illegitimate in eating disorder spaces, and that is starting to change. It's really important that that changes, and it's important that you know that eating disorders disproportionately affect fat people. So it is very important to read the work of fat scholars while doing this work. Here are some fat people you should know. I highly recommend screenshotting this slide. These are incredible educators that I highly recommend following on Instagram. They make incredible educational content. Um, uh, Three of them that I've highlighted here are Aubrey Gordon, Deshaun Harrison, and Caleb Luna. The three of them are three of my favorite people in that space. And then there are some books that I highly recommend. Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, and What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by Aubrey Gordon. Those are incredible resources, and you will learn so much about fat scholarship from them. And also, there are some fat podcasts I highly recommend. Unsolicited Fatties Talk Back is an incredible podcast. The Fat Doctor podcast by Dr. Asher Laramie, an incredible podcast. And Maintenance Phase with Aubrey Gordon, is also an incredible podcast for unlearning a lot of the harmful myths that diet culture perpetuates. It's really important as an advocate that you learn and update your vocabulary. Um, it's really important. The words that we use frame the world we live in. They communicate how much you care to the community that you're talking to. You have to constantly be updating your vocabulary. So here are some newer vocabulary terms and words that I recently, and by recently I mean since I started doing advocacy work, learned about. Um, First of all, there's the O word and overweight. These are outdated terms. They are largely harmful. They are specifically categories on the BMI scale, which, if you are involved in this work, I'm sure you understand and are aware of the fact that BMI is just simply an unreliable indicator of really anything. It is a statistical mess, and it should absolutely not be used in a healthcare setting. And these words are often weaponized against fat people and people who are not straight sized. They are like violently used against them in healthcare settings. And it's time that we stop using them and call people out for using them, or rather call people in for using them. Um, it is also important that we don't say the word mid-sized. Mid-sized is almost exclusively used in conversations about how, like, we need to see the mid-sized people rise up because the fat people had their moment and the skinny people had their moment, and now it's time for the mid-sized people to have their moment. And it's like, no, we should actually just be making sure that the fattest people in society, their bodies are normalized, and that immediately normalizes anyone slimmer than them. Focusing on mid-size liberation does nothing for the fattest people in society, whereas focusing on the fattest people in society and their liberation liberates all people, including mid-sized people. The term fat, which I'm sure you've heard me say multiple times, the term fat is something that a lot of fat scholars prefer to be used. It is a word that has historically been harmful or used in a harmful way, but it is not, it shouldn't be. And we're trying to destigmatize it by using it in educational and non-harmful ways. Fat is a totally acceptable term to use. It is not something that you should call someone unless they personally identify as fat and have told you that they identify as fat, because it still carries a lot of weight in society. But if you were talking about fat liberation and body liberation in particular, using the term fat is absolutely okay and actually preferred. Um, there's also fat phobia versus anti-fatness. Framing something as a phobia kind of implies that it is something that people are scared of, when a lot of times people are just really hateful towards fat people. And so the term anti-fatness is something that Aubrey Gordon advocates for being used in place of fat phobia often, because anti-fatness really describes what anti-fat people are doing, which is not really like a fear of fat people. It is a hatred towards fat people. It is a consistent act of violence against fat people. There's also skinny shaming versus fat shaming, which is a really fun internet discourse thing that comes up every few months. And ultimately, no one should be shaming you for your body ever, whether you are skinny or fat. But if you are being skinny shamed, you have to understand that while no one should be commenting on your body does not bring upon you systemic oppression. Whereas if you are fat shaming someone, not only are you commenting on their body, which is inherently wrong, but you are also like perpetuating and participating in systemic anti-fatness and social anti-fatness. Um, There's also internalized fat phobia versus fat phobia, which is a slip a lot of people make when talking about eating disorders and talking about specifically restrictive eating disorders. But the thing is, you can't have internalized fat phobia unless you are fat. Similarly to how you cannot have internalized homophobia unless you are gay. Otherwise, it is just homophobia. And if you are not a fat person experiencing fat phobia, or experiencing like fat phobia from yourself, like you are being fat phobic, or you are being anti-fat, that is just fat phobia. That is your own fear of fatness, but it's not internalized because you are not a fat person. I mean, if you are a fat person, it's internalized fat phobia, and it's something to work on because you don't deserve to treat yourself like that, and society shouldn't be treating you like that either. Um, it's really important when learning and updating vocabulary, uh, especially when you're telling other people about it, to be gentle. Not everyone takes it upon themselves to look up vocabulary, especially people who are not advocates and constantly talking about all of this stuff. So it's important to be gentle when educating people. If you can afford the emotional space to do so, and that's where allyship comes in. I'm not going to tell you as a fat person, if you are a fat person, to be gentle educating people on body liberation or fat liberation, because it is your own liberation. But if you are an ally to a community, try to be gentle in place of the people who cannot be gentle because they can't afford the emotional capacity to. Offer to teach people what you know, and do not expect others to teach you. When they do, especially if they're marginalized, you should pay them. A lot of people who are marginalized educators have a payment handle somewhere in their bio on their social media, or they have books out, they have some kind of media you can purchase. You should absolutely be supporting them in that way if you can. You also definitely should not get too personal when talking about your story and your eating disorder. Uh, there's a lot of danger in personal stories. Um, Often personal stories include triggering details like numbers and weights and meals, meal sizes, body sizes, proportions, portions. It's never good to go into those details because they invite comparison. Um, and so you have to think, is this helpful, this thing that I'm sharing? The point of being a recovery advocate is to advocate for recovery. It is not to talk about your trauma publicly. It is to help people. You want to help people realize things about themselves. You want to validate that people are going through real things and encourage them to get help, encourage them to reach out to professionals in this field and look for resources when they can't access those professionals because of financial barriers. And especially if you are a medical professional or not, you should not be giving personal advice on the internet to people, because everyone is different at the end of the day, and also they're not right there in front of you. And oftentimes, when you are exclusively an advocate like I am, you are not qualified to be giving personal advice. The best thing you can do when people reach out to you personally is give them the advice. Here's who you should reach out to. Now, you can personalize that advice of like, I think it would be really great for you to reach out to a registered dietitian, or I think it would be really great for you to reach out to this specific registered dietitian who covers this specific thing. If they can't take you, maybe someone else in community with them can. But you never want to give that personal advice yourself. Um, I already said it, but do not encourage comparison. Body checking on social media on a recovery account has no place. Photos of your body are not inherently body checks, but when you're like moving to the side and moving to the front and just like looking at yourself in a mirror in along with like music in a TikTok, that is very clearly not just you like existing. That is you checking out your body and displaying it in a way that could be really harmful to a lot of people, especially if you're using like eating disorder recovery hashtags or you've built an audience around eating disorder recovery. And also, like, no one needs to see your weight loss transformation or your weight gain transformation, though most people don't post those. People definitely don't need to see your weight loss transformation because there's no way to do that and not have incredibly incredibly strong anti-fatness behind it. Because when you're posting that on social media, you are you're putting it there to be congratulated on losing weight, and that is, no matter what, going to make people feel bad about themselves. Also, what I eat in a day videos. Those can be kind of popular in the recovery community, and they shouldn't be, because what I eat in a day videos, um, they encourage comparison. People who have eating disorders are very competitive, and they're going to be looking at the food that you are eating, and they're going to go, am I eating less than them? Am I eating more than them? They're going to hyper analyze what you are eating, and they might change the way they're eating based on that, which is not something you want to be encouraging them to do if you are in a recovery space. So what I eat in a day videos, maybe don't do it. Um, and so how can you become an advocate? I think it's really important to identify the missing voice. Is it me? Is it someone else? In my case, I was a missing voice, which is a really weird place for me to be in as a cis white man. But I am often a diversity voice in the eating disorder recovery space because a lot of men don't talk about eating disorder recovery. Um, so I was a missing voice in this situation. Um, is your voice missing? Is there is there something you grew up wishing that you had seen more representation for that you did not see? That that is something that you could be for those people if it doesn't exist now. You could be that person that you could have looked up to as a child. I am currently that person that I wish I could have gone and watched the content of when I was in the depths of my eating disorder at the beginning of serious recovery. Also think, how can I amplify the missing voice? If the missing voice isn't you, if it's someone else that you know, or if it's someone else that you know of, share their content, recommend it to friends, put it on your Instagram story, do whatever you can to spread that voice, because ultimately that's how we as a society become more accepting and that we grow. And it's also really important to do research when amplifying a missing voice or amplifying your own voice. um, Also, you should always operate from a place of empathy. Always listen and always learn, and never assume that you have all the answers. And that specifically goes out to men who assume that they do, or really anyone who assumes that they have all the answers. And constantly consider, is what I'm doing harmful? Is what I'm doing helpful? Ultimately, you always want to be coming from a place of, this is helpful and this doesn't have any net harm, you know? And so ultimately, representation is everything. The world is only made better by diversity, and by proxy, diversity of advocacy. The more people we have out there sharing their stories, the less alone people feel. And you could very well be that change that you want to see in the world, as Gandhi once said. And so I'm going to open it up to questions now. Um, and I'm really grateful that you came to this presentation.
So thank you, William, first of all. Before you get into questions, I do see one question here, but I just wanted to say thank you for the session and the information. It was super informal. I have a question, but I'm going to go. There is a question posted that's, do you have any recommendations for how people can recognize subtle but toxic content like body checking videos and what to do when they do encounter it.
Okay, yeah, sure. So, first of all, rely on your instincts. If you are experiencing an eating disorder, or if you have any kind of body image problems and you're watching something and it makes you feel uncomfortable, investigate that. Does it make you feel uncomfortable because like you personally are uncomfortable with it? And it's just like an issue that you need to work through? Or is it uncomfortable because that person like didn't take people like you into consideration? And if you end up coming to the conclusion of the person who posted that did not take you or people like you into consideration when posting that, considering like, is this going to be harmful for other people? I think it is perfectly acceptable to report that content. Reporting that content might not do anything for you. It also might not end up getting taken down. But also, there's always the option to block that person. If you're consistently getting content like that, especially from people you don't know, if it's a person you know, you might want to handle it with more sensitivity. But if it's like an influencer that you follow who doesn't know you exist, like just block them. It's fine. They won't know. They don't care. And it's going to be better for you that you don't see content like that that makes you uncomfortable. And also, if you're consistently getting content that makes you uncomfortable, you can also like clear your cache on TikTok specifically, cache spelled CASHE. And that will erase TikTok's entire memory of like what it thinks you like. And if it is picked up on the fact that you engage with triggering content because you're mentally ill, that is a good way of resetting the way that TikTok presents things to you.
I did not know that about TikTok. That is super useful, I'm sure, for a lot of people based on
Yeah,
how TikTok operates and the rabbit hole of the algorithm. So, I had a question for you. I
sure.
feel like so many of the principles you presented here are things that should be normalized. And I think for many, the word advocacy is a really scary word that implies something really more intensive than it is. And I feel like I hear people talking about advocacy in this way of like they're putting their advocacy hat on and saying all the right things. But I mean, what advice would you give to someone that's hearing these things that you're presenting here today, and maybe doing some of them, but not all of them, and trying, but knowing that it's okay and that they're doing enough?
Um, Ultimately, what I would say is so long as you are operating from a place of empathy and a place of curiosity and you have good intentions, it doesn't really matter whether uh, people are critical of you so long as you are listening to that criticism and correcting it with um, as much curiosity and empathy as you are sharing your previous perspective. Um, it's really important to care about what people are saying and care about the ways that you are impacting people with what you're putting out into the world. And so if your advocacy isn't perfect, cool. Mine wasn't at first. I definitely talked a little bit too much about uh, like it being okay to be fat so long as you're healthy early on in my advocacy. And I always held the belief that like it is okay to be fat no matter what, but the way that I was phrasing things really made it sound like I thought that it was like immoral to be fat if you weren't also healthy. And so I had to do a lot of reading and investigating into healthism and into morality's relationship with health. And I no longer see health as anywhere near a moral responsibility. But that's something that I did not even consider before I started doing this kind of advocacy work. And it's something that I got called on at one point, and I chose to listen, and I did, um, and effectively was able to educate myself on the topic, and then actively work to spread it and um, spread the word of people who are advocating against healthism. So uh, you're probably not going to be a perfect advocate off the bat. And I wouldn't call myself a perfect advocate, but I try very hard. And so long as you're trying very hard and you're not operating from a place of expecting that you know everything, and like unwilling to hear other people, you're going to be fine.
Great.
I hope that
Thanks.
answered the question.
Absolutely. Sounds like a little bit of humility mixed with a little bit of empathy and a lot of listening is sort of the recipe you're talking about. So
Absolutely.
I
That's a great way to put it.
I appreciate that. We'll have you again tomorrow on a session, a chat with Abhilash Patel and Allison Walsh about um, lived experience and advocacy for men with eating disorders. And is there where can people hear more about you? Where's the best way for people to find you?
They can find me at William Hornby on Instagram and TikTok. You can find me on my website, williamhornby.com. And you can also email me personally at williamdavidhornby@gmail.com. Also, we have an anonymous attendee who has asked us to wait. um, I get the feeling that they are typing a question as we speak.
Oh, let's see if there's a question. Was there a question? Anonymous attendee? Don't have a name next to you, so.
Thanks for being here, anonymous attendee. I really appreciate it.
All right, well, if you do have a question for William, he's got his info, and yeah, otherwise he will also be on a session tomorrow where there will be a live Q&A, so please join us for that. That'll be a good time to do it. And yeah, thanks again, William, for joining us. Really appreciate the time and the session, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So thanks so much.
I look forward to seeing you tomorrow as well. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.